Hi, I'm Ed Edmonds with Distortions Unlimited, and you're watching Monster Lab. Now, in the last episode, we showed you how to sculpt these hands. And hands are very complicated, and the molding of hands is very complicated. So if you decide to make a pair of hands, and you don't watch this video, you will hate yourself and your life and everything you've ever done. Okay, so I start with wet clay. And now the tool that cuts the clay is like this. You don't have to do this. You can use a wire or you can use a knife, but try to get it about a ½ inch, maybe slightly more. I usually use a little more on mass. This, because we're going in and out of fingers, I get it a little thinner. So you cut it. That gives you your ½ inch. And then I cut it in half. And that gives you this nice sheet of clay. Now, I start down on the edges, and we're gonna be filling this in. It's all gonna be one 2-piece mold, not four pieces of plaster. It's much easier to do it this way. So you come up the edge like that. Now, as you work, and I'm pushing it in lightly, but as you work, you should go around back and take clay balls, because the clay is gonna, gravity makes this stuff just wanna fall off. So you take clay balls and push them into the hand, but don't smooth them into the hand, just push it in the hand so you create a vacuum, and then smooth them into the clay. And you do that as you work, and that'll save so much misery. And these, again, are things that we've learned over the years that just help. And since hands are complicated, there's not a lot of room for mistakes, and they're it's heartbreaking. And we've had dams fall off in the middle of casting them, and oh boy, talk about fire alarms and misery, because you can destroy a mold. And so these steps are really important. And I want to say this before I forget. Now, these hands are fairly, as you can see, they're fairly straight up and down. And that's good for gravity and stuff. If you're planning on not ever producing them in a 1-piece mold, in a 2-piece mold only, you can have the fingers go down like this. But you gotta be careful. You've gotta think as you lay up the dam that you're not creating a mold that won't come off. Now, sometimes you can think about it and go, I could do this, it'll come off. But you just have to watch those angles, and you don't want a situation where you're wrapping and you've got something in here and you can't pull those molds apart. So watch for that as you work. It's not that complicated. You just need to stop and look. So after you get those on and you know that piece is secure, you get another piece. And this piece we're gonna put right here. Now I'm gonna cut this a little bit off at an angle. So I just cut that little piece off so it'll go on easier. And you don't have to, but it's just helpful. And again, go back here. And I'm putting my hand over here, so as I push, I'm not going to disrupt the clay, but I'm pushing into the sculpture, blending into the dam. I'm also going to put a couple balls out here. And the reason you don't want to blend it into the sculpture is it'll be terrible getting that clay off there. But if it's just pushed on, as you pull the dam off, most of those balls will come off, and it's easy. Okay. I'm going to focus on one hand first. Normally I do them both and move the same, but that way I can speed up the second hand and this doesn't last forever. So this one is a little more tricky. So you push it in the best you can, try to divide it in the middle, and try to get as much of a vacuum as you can. And then, now I need a space like this all the way around. So I don't want to cut right here. I'm going to be cutting up here. And I've recommended this before, but don't use sharp knives. Dull knives work for clay just fine. So now this is fragile, and so I'll have to kind of be careful and get some of these clay balls on right away. And sometimes they fall. It's okay, you just pick it up, do some more, but you're really pushing it with gravity on hands like this. This is a totally different animal than putting a dam around a mass. There's just lots of perilous times when you're doing fingers. Once you start to get more and more fingers on, or more clay dams on the fingers, then you can start bridging the fingers, and it's a little less hair raising. So see how that's making a nice division. I'm coming up the center of the finger. I'm going to do this, even though this comes later, just to give it just that little bit more vacuum. And you don't want to push too hard, but I actually, if the clay is reasonably hard, you can push lightly against your sculpture and get a nice clean. The ultimate is to get a nice 90-degree angle wherever you can. So now, here's one of the tricks that that I use, and it involves trying to visually look at this space and say, okay, my clay needs to be, boy, it's almost as tall as that. I'm going to go ahead and leave it. So I look at this shape and I cut it, but just a little bit smaller. And so it starts at a point, it widens up, and then semi-straight. So let's see if I get it right the first time. Okay, so it starts small, and then pretty quick widens up. See how good my memory is here. And it stays kind of like that, and then when it gets to the end, it widens up a little because of the finger. So I end up with something like this. Now here's the trick. Okay, so I take this shape and I stick it between the fingers. And you know, it doesn't have to be perfect. Like I just squished it in because I was a little too thin. And then, here's the trick. You squeeze it. And so it's not quite hitting here. Well, I squeeze it and make it hit. And so you're getting some strength in the pushing between the fingers. And then I come over here, miss the top of the fingernail, and blend it in here. And as soon as you can, get the weight off of stuff, because it's gonna, you know, you're constantly battling gravity when you're doing hands. Now, I'm going to bridge between both fingers because I can grab this clay that's really strong. I can push into this clay, and man, that holds it. And then I've got a vacuum here. I've got a solid connection. I got a solid connection there. So that brings in the safety that you need to keep this thing from falling. And, you know, when you learn lessons the hard way, it really cements them. But it's so much nicer if you can learn those lessons the easy way and not have to go through the tears and the years of therapy and crying on your friend's shoulders or whatever. Because let me tell you, when you've invested a lot of time in a sculpture, it becomes a part of you or something almost. And it's like, you know, if you lost something that you spent a lot of time on, it's like, I don't know, the dog died or something. It's pretty rough, especially if you're an artist and you've got that artist kind of passion and you love what you've done and you're so excited, and then suddenly it's dead. It's very hard to take. You kind of have to experience that sometimes to understand it. So I've got this flap of clay that I need to brace. So we're going to build a foundation starting down here with clay that's well connected, and just come up and start, you know, get some width here and build on that. So that as this thing tries to fall, it's braced like straight down. And I don't have to do this on every finger, certainly, but to have a foundation of like somebody just standing there and holding that clay for you. But the foundation can't go like this, because the foundation will actually, if I just blend this into here, blended that into there, then now I've got even more weight that wants to fall. But by coming down to here, I've got the support of the hand and all this sticking to clay that's pretty solid. In fact, I'm going to put a little piece right here just to be sure. Okay, so, and then this, of course, gets blended in anywhere you can. You don't want to blend it in hard to the sculpture. So all these places I've blended in, I'm just laying the clay and pushing it into the sculpture, but I'm actually blending it into the clay wherever I can. And that way it should all just go like that when you go to pull it out. But see, now I've solided that up. I'm trying to use words that don't exist apparently. Okay, so we continue with my best guess. Goes to about 1 inch. Again, I'm pushing. And you may be tempted to, I'll just do a few of them and then I'll brace them. Wouldn't do it, because then they all fall together. They all come down together. So this stuff will save you so much of unnecessary misery. You know, I want to say something. When we asked what people wanted to see, hands down, no pun intended, that's not true. Hands down, people wanted to see hands. And so we did a little search, and we couldn't find any hand things. And so what's important to us, the reason we do Monster Lab, is we want to make this as easy as possible so that when you do it, you succeed. And you don't have to go through a destroyed mold after putting in days working on something. And I can tell you, I think what drives me specifically is when I started this business, nobody was talking. Nobody in the industry, at least nobody I could find, they wouldn't tell you how to do things. You'd call up and they're like, get out of here and so forth. And so I had some help along the way. My dentist helped me. He showed me where to get dental plaster. I used to use dental plaster. The USG representative showed me how to mix plaster. The way I'm going to show you, yes, you can weigh it. You can get a big scale. You can get a motor with a paddle, and all these things we do. But there's a simple way to do these things that will help you to succeed the first time. And so that's why we do these videos. It's just to miss as much misery as possible when you're trying to learn to make monsters. And I tell you, there is something, and I don't know what it is. It's a little bit of a Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein thing or something. But there is something that, if you've done it, you know, but when you create something and it's come out of your mind and you use your hands, you made this thing and you paint it and you put it on and you become that character, I don't know, there's something really special about that, and you kind of have to do it to experience it. And it's just hard when you're trying to do it and you have failure after failure. So we're trying to simplify stuff. There's probably other people would do this and say, oh no, I don't do it that way, this way's better. They might be right, but this way for us is like not fail-proof, but close to fail-proof, and it's easy, and you don't have to have tons of specialized equipment and expensive stuff. You can just do this. And so I recommend you watch this maybe more than once, because there's a lot of information here, but at least once before you attempt to do this, because you'll have problems, and instead of watching a 45-minute video, you'll spend 3 or 4 days resculpting them and another half a day making the mold, and you'll have learned the lesson though. You'll learn it that way too. Okay, so I'm not going to build a big thing there. I've got this one that's pretty strong, and I'm going to connect then this to that. And so just take a little piece of clay and squish it to about the right size. We're gonna stick that in there, and I'm squeezing like this to make it go and connect and make a good solid connection. And we'll come back later and we'll clean up these edges nicely, but for right now, that's good enough. I'm going to take some of the weight off of this. I don't need quite that much. Let's just see if we get lucky here. This one might just be close enough. Now you may be thinking, oh, he makes it look so easy. It actually is easy. It's just stuff that goes on in your head that makes it hard. It's kind of funny, but if you really pay attention and use these techniques, monster making is a series of pretty darn simple steps. There's a lot of them, but if you know those steps and you know the materials, boy, it's amazing what you can accomplish. I'm a little low there, so I'm gonna cut that one a little higher, and then Stick it on there. All right, go back. This going across, connecting and going across to the other side where it's strong. Boy, that makes this stuff tough. I'm just squishing it in the finger, and then I'm blending it into the clay. And I know it's kind of seems like a waste of clay, but you know, wood clay is not that expensive, and so if you figure out what your time's worth, and you have to throw everything away, plus the time you spent to make it, the clay that I'm using here, pretty small consideration in terms of what the entire piece is going to cost you in time and money. And I realize that's not very pretty, but it doesn't have to be. Only this has to be pretty. We'll make that side look pretty, because there's lots of little tricks with the plaster and stuff that we're going to want to make that as clean as possible, so you don't have issues later when you go to demold. But this is all about support. That's really all we're concerned about. Now I'm probably going to bring down, let's see, probably right here. I'm going to bring down another foundational support. Okay, so I've got a pretty good foundation here, and I realize that I didn't explain the paint. Now, there's a couple of things. This clay has been dried out pretty good. You want these fingers to be pretty solid, not bone dry, because bone dry is a problem. Bone dry is going to give you problems, but just firm. And I used a fan to accomplish that. Then I sprayed them last night so that they were completely covered with spray paint. I put a couple of coats on, try to aim up, spray down, and use a gloss enamel out of a spray can. I used this. This is an Ace product, but Krylon Leather Brown is very good, but it should be glossy. And you want to cover it well a couple times, and basically what that does is it becomes like a plastic bag over your sculpture to protect it. Now they still can dry out. Don't think that's going to save you, but that gives you the combination of having it dry and having that spray paint gives you a solid sculpture that you can then push clay around on it and push it into it. If this was as soft as the clay that I'm pushing into, you could start messing up your sculpture. So this is a fairly hard thing now. It's fairly solid. But hand molds, since they're two-piece, you can break them apart, and the clay is easy to get out, even if it's hard. And that's why we're making a two-piece mold. If you think you could make something like this and pull it out of a one-piece mold, just imagine in your mind digging through the cave and trying to get to the tip of this with some kind of curved, funny tool. It's got to be a two-piece mold. Trust me on that. Now, if they were really, really small and you don't mind spending 6 hours picking clay out, fine. And if you do find yourself in a situation like that, a water pick works pretty good. You can get in there and blast little bits of clay, and air can help and things too. But that's why we do do it this way. That's why we paint them, and that's why we can then push into this clay. The other thing that's nice, once you have painted clay that's hard, as you're pulling the clay off, you can tell when you've got old clay and new clay, because the old clay is covered by paint. It's very, very helpful. Okay, so now we're going to get into a little bit of an exotic situation here that comes from having a hand in a natural position. Now, if I put that hand like this, that would be great, because then everything's flat and so forth. Not completely flat. I have to break my thumb, bring it up in the same plane. So I've got to go from here to here. Now, here's the problem with going from there to there, is we could end up locking the mold if I did that. So what I'm going to do, let's see, I might even, because that's a pretty hard turn. I'm just barely pyramid in. I think I can do it, but I think what I'll do is I'm going to leave that finger, it'll go into the mold as a solid piece, and that'll give me a flatter mold, and I think that's going to be safer than trying to wrap around. Let's see. Yes, because see, if I went from the finger here, I was already planning on leaving that in the mold and just having a little stub to clean out of one of the halves, but I think I'm going to go ahead and maybe just avoid it altogether and come around to here. I have to think about this a moment. Stop the tape. Okay, so I've figured it out. I think the safest way to approach this is to go ahead and submerge these two fingers in the second half of the mold. It's only going to give me, I'll only have to clean out clay that deep down a tunnel, and it'll be pretty straight and it'll be accessible because it's a two-piece mold. So I'm going to actually move this clay over here and then come up like that, and it's going to create much less potential problems. And this is where you need to make sure you're not going to end up with a situation we talked about earlier where this is going to lock your mold in. So just round that off a little. That looks good. Okay, we're gonna brace that. See, now this thumb will be like an inch away, and so there'll be plenty of plaster around it, and it'll just be one little thing. I gotta go down a tunnel and get out. But I couldn't do that on these long fingers. It just, I shouldn't say couldn't. We've done some crazy stuff, but it'd be much, much harder. So again, I'm pushing into the sculpture, the old painted sculpture, and I'm blending in here, and that gives you maximum strength without hurting your sculpture. And these balls, I wouldn't make them too big, because you're better to have a bunch of little ones. It's just much more controllable, and you can move them around better. So at no point have I blended into the sculpture. I've just pushed into the sculpture. Now I got a little helpmate right here. I've got this thumb. I can put a little clay in there and build some strength. And I think I will come up a little bit with a pillar of clay to strengthen. And we'll put a little. Okay. Now you can test it by giving a little wiggle test and make sure it's pretty solid. But that is how you make a dam. Now we're going to speed through this side, but I want to show you the techniques for blending this in to the edges and then keying, which is key. So we're gonna zip through this side, and we'll see you on the other side of lightning fast sculpting.
Look out! Get down now! Watch out! They're coming out fast!
Okay, so the dam is all there. It just needs to be refined. It's braced here, but now here's a trick I learned years ago. Now it's kind of hard to deal with this. So I could bring up some massive thing of clay, but and usually I use these sticks, but this is so tall that the stick isn't even long enough. So I'm going to tape two of them together. Probably something like that. And just give it a helpful holder. So you make a nice thing. I'm gonna stick this on good. It's amazing how much that little bit of water helps that thing stick. So, put it in here. Okay, so this isn't going to win any beauty pageants, I get that, but you don't care, no one will ever see it. Well, you see this, but no one needs to know that it's just, everything's there to protect the sculpture. I think I've got everything locked in place pretty good. I'm going to add just a little more. Okay. Okay. That is not rock solid, but it's pretty solid. Okay, so now I'm going to clean this all up. Now, you can see how I've pretty well flattened out this shape. And the ins and outs that are there are not a problem. They'll actually help lock the molds together, but we're also going to put keys to make sure that happens. I'm looking to make sure none of these angles are too great, but they'll be able to, right now, the way this is, they'll be able to just separate like that. So I'm going to smooth this and clean up my edges, and I'll show you that, and then we'll probably speed through this a little bit. You just get this is a tool you can buy. This comes from Reynolds. They have everything. If you can find a Reynolds near you, but any kind of a sculpting supply kind of place may have some of these tools and things. And of course, you can get on the internet and find them. The nice thing about a company like Reynolds is they have people that, you can say, hey, I want to do this, and they'll help you. You can ask them all sorts of questions. Now I'm going to smooth more, but this one just smooths big flat planes. And the smoother this is, the better. I'm up a little high. I'm going to actually sit down so I'm facing this better. Okay. So there's one area that's a little more than I want as far as angles. So I'm going to fill that in. This one's much smoother. This one kind of dives in, if you can see that. So I'm going to give that a little bit of clay. And don't be afraid to stop and think about what you're doing and make sure there's no obvious mistakes that are going to give you problems. Just take time and look at it. Now a tool like this comes in handy because where there are curves, you can use this side. And then when you're in a big flat plane, you can use the other side. For some reason, the thin metal really beats down the clay actually better than the fat ones, the big plastic ones. That they work well, but on bigger planes usually. But this, I think part of what it is I'm doing this. So I'm actually bending it around the sculpture, and I'm getting it to smooth just the way I want. That's just a little detail that I wasn't even conscious that I was doing. But it just makes this fast and easy. So I'm going to continue smoothing. We'll speed it up, and then I'll come back and we'll start talking about keys and other things. So we'll zip through this real quick here. Okay, so that's all smoothed out well enough for right now, and we're going to put in keys. And keys are key, no pun intended, that's not true, in order to make sure that the molds lock together and line up perfectly. And there's a lot of fancy ways you can do keys, little silicone things, all this stuff you can make. We're going to do it the way I like, which is you just start pushing in and you make like a half of a circle. And it's really important that it's not too severe. You got to ease into it. And I like to get pretty close to the sculpture so you get maximum effect. I hope you can see that, but we put them all the way around. Now this one, again, it's got so many ins and outs, I don't need tons of them, but if this was a pretty flat plane, we might put in, 4 to 6 or something, depending on what it is. But I've got this indentation, but I'm making sure and rounding into it slowly. And the reason I like making keys this way is they're strong. There's no little hard edges, they're not small, they're big, they become part of the plaster mold. Let's see, and you want to be careful to not put a key in a real heavily angled area, because then when you pull, it's not going to want to come out. I think that I've got so many ins and outs, I can put a single key on top, these two on the bottom. Like I say, normally you would have more, but since these are at a severe angle, I just don't think we need them there. I might put one down here too. So, and I'm squeezing the clay, and partially I'm bending it. So it's a little thinner, but it plenty strong. And then I'm rounding out those edges so it'll just glide in. And then I'll put one right here. Okay, and those will further be smoothed when I sponge it. So the next step is taking the little finger tool, and these are wonderful. It's like a little finger, and just going down, and I can actually push just slightly on the sculpture, not much. Because it's hard, I can push a little. And you Dremel these lines anyway, so if you did make a little bit of a line or something, it gets taken out. But also, as you do this, if your clay isn't exactly where you want it to be, you can just scrape off more as you go. Let's see if you can see this. So I'm getting this really nice, clean edge. And again, think 90 degrees whenever you do these. And here I'm going to dig a little bit because it's a little high there. And I'm just going to come down. Okay, it's confession time.
Listen, 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 listen.
One of these fingers broke off. And I was so glad it didn't happen when I was doing this side, because it's embarrassing. And right here you can see it. The clay had dried, and I hadn't made my wires long enough. I ended up making these fingers much longer than I originally intended. So I got this piece of clay out there, and it dried enough and cracked and was loose. And so as I built the dam, I just made sure it was supported, and I'll probably just put a little cheater clay like this in there.
Try to focus on the positive.
And it's fixed, and it'll be our little secret. All right, so continuing on. So you go around each of the fingers and adjusting, because you, if possible, like this clay is too high, so I want to get that down a little because I don't want to have that seam line on the fingernail itself. It's nice if I can keep it down, and then I can come up to the fingernail. And so I'm actually going to get rid of some of this clay. And so now this has made a bulge, so I want to stay flat as much as possible. And so I'll just make an angle here. And then I can just run down the finger. I'm going deep here because it was a little high. So this made a little where it dug in. I'm gonna smooth it out. This is a little bit high, so I'm gonna take that down. So that's the goal, to get this nice and level. It doesn't matter if they go up and down a little, but it's just helpful to keep it as clean and right angled as possible. Okay. Now here I need a little clay, so I'm just pushing some clay in. And that's really, from there on out, I'm just going to repeat. We're going to speed the camera up so you can still see it, but that's the key, is to get that right up next to it, and we'll do some further smoothing in a minute here. But that's what you want the whole thing to look like when we get through. So here we go, we're gonna rock and roll. Okay, so now we're going to smooth, and this little tool and this little tool, these are great. This is a very porous black sponge. It really knocks stuff down quickly. And you just dip it in the water, squeeze it out a little, and then just, you know, whatever is kind of hanging around. Try not to rake it over your sculpture too much. I'm turning it sideways. So this works great. Now you don't have to have this. You can smooth it. In fact, you don't even need that. You could just smooth it with your fingers, but these kinds of tools just accelerate the job. Okay, so now we're going to go to the sponge, and the sponge is going to smooth this very nicely and easily. I'm squeezing it pretty good. You don't want this to be too wet. But as you can see, it's very quick because of all the other stuff we've done. And also, if you flip the sponge, you know, over, and then you can do it and then flip it like that and do it. So you got like 4 different shots with one dip. And I'm not pushing real hard, but enough that you might want to put your hand on the other side sometimes. Now here, I think I've actually squeezed there's kind of just the right amount of water to leave in there so it breaks it down without having to push too hard. These are all subtle things, but you know, as you get more and more familiar with damming, it's helpful. This also exposes, like this isn't real smooth and I can see it now, so I can go in and just get it really nice. And it doesn't matter, like I'm getting some of the sponging on there. It's very thin. It's not going to affect the sculpture at all. It's just a very thin layer of muddy water, I guess. But I want to get right up to the sculpture. And these keys, I want to get them really smooth too. Okay. Now, there's 2 more things. You can do this with a knife. I like to use this tool because it glides through the clay better than a knife. So I get the handle out of the way, and you know, be careful, but just go along. You just want to end up with a fairly even width all the way around. And there's one last thing that I like to do in case you're getting a little crazy with the plaster, and that is to cover this side of the hands. Let me get a bag here. So, just take some sort of tool. Try not to hit your sculpture, but just hold that bag in this. This isn't super important, but let me tell you, very irritating if you got to clean off chunks of plaster because they spilt over the top of this. Just one of those things that over the years you get tired of fixing problems you've made, so this just helps. All right, so there it is. This is ready to cast. And since I'm no longer a starving artist, I'm going to go have lunch, and we're going to come back and we're going to cast this and show you how to do it, and do it fast and easy. Be right back. Okay, so now we're ready to make the mold, and you don't need much. You need a chip brush. I like the 1 inch, that gets around the details pretty good. And then pottery plaster, which we use number 1 USG pottery plaster, and a clean bucket with water. Now, I've got this thing maybe about a third full. We'll see how that goes. You just kind of have to guess at what you're going to need, and we'll do a batch that will build up the majority of the thickness, and then we'll put some hemp on. That'll be the second batch. So let's get started. So I'm just kind of sifting it through my hands, getting the lumps out of it as best I can. And the goal here is to don't dump it in, because by doing it this way, you can get a good ratio without weighing. Of course, you can weigh this, and if you want to weigh it and have the ability to, that's all the better. But this was taught to me by a USG guy in the early days, and I use it a lot when I'm in a situation like this where I'm not in the mold room with all the equipment, and it works very good. In fact, the way I do it, it's a little bit thicker. Gives you a little more working time, and that's good. I shouldn't say more working time. It may even give you a little less working time, but it gives you more working time when it's in a thicker state. And that's what you need. You need to build it up, because according to the normal USG measurements, it's a little runny, and it stays runny a long time, so you're sitting there twiddling your thumbs. To do it this way, it's a little thicker, and you can start having it build up a thickness very quickly. So the goal is, and we've done this in other films, but the goal is to start forming islands over the whole top of it. And if you put it in like this, kind of sifting it through your fingers, if you get to the point where the islands don't go away, and you don't want big, like mountainous islands, just just where the plaster has stopped absorbing. That's a real good point to stop. Okay, so I'm starting to get islands formed all over the top of it. Now, I'll also be careful to spread the plaster out over the whole surface of the water. Don't just keep dumping in the middle because you won't get the full feel for it. I'm going to put a little more around the edges, make sure that it's really saturated. And you're not under really the gun at this point because until you start to agitate it, it doesn't really... I'm not saying it wouldn't set up, but there's something about stirring it that starts the chemical crystallization or whatever it does. So it looks like that's kind of where we want to be. And so I'm going to start mixing up. Now, as I mix, you won't be able to see it, but I'm doing this. I'm squeezing and stirring. I'm scraping the edges. I'm scraping the bottom. I'm trying to get rid of all the bubbles and chunks of plaster. Try not to whip a bunch of air into it either. This method's pretty good for not doing that. And, you know, you don't have to rush too much, but you don't want to loiter either. And here we go. Now a little cup like this comes in handy. So you just dip it in the cup and get a good amount on it. It's a little sloppy, so you know, don't do this in your living room. But you want to get a good amount on right off the bat so you can start working it. Another trick you can do is kind of pour it into your hand. Now this is a little tough because it's such a high vertical, or vertical and even a little more than that. But you'll kind of get it all around. And again, don't get too tied up and, oh, I missed a spot. That's not so important. What's really important right now, now that I've got it covered, is to go and do the vertical and horizontal thing. So I'm getting all the vertical details here. Now I'm going to go horizontal. I'm going to pour a little more on just to, because I should have all those details now. And you don't want to necessarily go in and redo that. You want to leave it alone. You've gotten in those details. And pay attention. Don't just go through the motions. Pay attention where your brush is. Make sure it's hit everywhere. And then be somewhat mechanical about it. again, keeping in mind that there is a clock ticking, and you'll want to beat the clock as far as the plaster thickening up. So let's see. Yeah, this extreme vertical stuff would just have to get better when it starts to thicken up more. But I like this consistency. This really gets you off to a good start, where you're getting some thickness on right away, and you're not so watery. Because then, if you go to specs, USG specs, which is 70/30, you're wasting the first 10 minutes, and it's just water almost. It's so runny. And then when it decides to start setting up, it's like, man, you're out of time. It's chemically starting to really kick. And so by starting with a little thicker plaster, it's helpful, at least to me. And so there might be times like this where you can pause. And if you are worried about something, say, wow, I was kind of rushing to this part. I'm not sure if I got those fingernails. Well, just go back. Now you got a little time, and redo them. And I actually, literally, was thinking that. It's like, I wonder if I got those fingernails good. Now there'll come a point where you'll see the brush go away, and we're just caking it on. And what I want you to watch for when I do that is how my hands move. And I'm sure different people do it different ways, but I like the idea of kind of moving like this, and even shaking, kind of with the idea of agitating it into the areas that I'm not really able to reach with my hands. So we took a break for 5 minutes, 7 minutes, something like that. And now it's starting to get thick. And some, for whatever reason, maybe it's the age of the plaster, could be humidity, temperature, we don't know. But I'm just filling in these areas. It's not quite ready to build up, but I'm filling in the deep crevices, knowing that that's where it's going to be tough to, when you start bringing it up in handfuls, to get into deep cracks like this. Yeah, it's getting there. So, and I didn't mention this earlier, but you should work with water that's tepid, that's just kind of room temperature, not real hot or cold. It just works better like that. Yeah, this is getting to where you can kind of put it, it's like mayonnaise a little bit, and you can get it to stay a little bit. And just try to get in all those deep areas. And you can kind of watch it. Like I can see that it's going into the crack well. between the wrist and the dam. And this is the point. You don't stop. I don't care if the president is on the red phone. You don't stop. You gotta go all the way.
Report any suspicious behavior to authorities.
This is where you use your dam to kind of make sure that you're getting it thick enough, and then you just have to pay attention to these areas that they're getting enough plaster. Okay, so I have a reasonable thickness over the whole thing. Now I'm going to do a smaller batch with hemp and put it on there. And that hemp is awesome because it protects the mold. It won't break easily. So let me get that batch going here real quick, and we'll be right back. Okay, so now I've mixed up a batch that's like thick, and we're talking, you're starting with something that's probably like mayonnaise thick, and then I'm dipping this hemp into it, and I'm just going to lay it up right on there, and you can put big blocks of hemp on here, and this is your strength. And I didn't make quite as big a batch, but pretty big. And just for the record, this batch ended up, it was like 1/3 of a bucket. And these are big hands, so you can make adjustments, but 1/3 of a bucket, and then of water. And then when I put the plaster in, it was about 2/3 of a bucket. And just get it over the whole surface. And this mold will be one strong hombre. And if you did drop it, it might still crack, but it would like hold together. And so it's not as bad. You can kind of, you know, fill in the cracks and be okay. And hemp is something you could get at a sculpture supply place or on Amazon. You could buy a bale of hemp and it will last you a long time. I don't know what the smallest amounts they sell. We've always bought them in bales and they last for many months. And we make a lot of molds. Okay, so that's it. The goal kind of with this is to just get it relatively smooth. So there's no pokes and stuff. And we're going to lay this down. And it's all downhill from now because the other side is much simpler. You'll see. But first we're going to pull the clay out and show you how to do that. Okay, so now you don't even have to wait because the first layer dried while we're putting the hemp layer on. And so you are good to go. So just pick a spot. You may want to use some tools sometimes, but you just start peeling the clay. You don't want to get too aggressive in case like a finger was coming off or something. And this takes a little bit. It's not going to be super fast. You can break some of this, the vacuum on some of this stuff. I won't reuse this clay for sculpture, even though you could, conceivably, because it's pretty fresh stuff. But what I am going to do is I'm going to use it to make a nice mold separation, and I'll show you that in a bit. It's a good use for it. just make sure there's no little pieces of clay hanging out. And then this is what you do with some of the extra clay. You just make snakes out of it. And I get it, you don't want to come in too far, but what you do want to do is make a little dam so that you can make absolutely sure you're not, because if you're putting the plaster and you're rolling it over here, you're going to have problems, trust me. Yeah, I'll get it off eventually, but not without a lot of cussing. So I'm blending it in to the plaster, and then I'm coming around here and just, well, I should have done it first, kind of anchoring it. And then you come in, smooth it, make sure it's sealed, and make sure there's still, you know, a good thickness, because that's how thick your plaster is going to be. Have I talked you out of making hands yet? It is kind of a lot of work. But if you're pretty serious about making monsters, they got to have hands. I mean, maybe some aliens, you could find some silver gloves or something, but. Okay, so now that I've got this separation so the mold halves won't lock, I'm going to put spray paint on this, but I don't want to spray it because I don't want to get spray paint on this. That needs to set for 4 hours minimum, and usually we do it overnight. I'm going to brush on paint onto this. Now, you can use tincture of green soap. That's kind of the fancy way to do it and works great. You can use Vaseline, which it works good, but I worry a little bit about Vaseline because Vaseline's not good for rubber. So not a bad deal, but if you slopped it around and stuff, it might mess it up. But the spray paint's great. It soaks into the plaster, dries fast, and makes a real good bond. And so you just spray the paint into a cup or something and brush it on. Okay, so I lied a little, I didn't mean to. We do save this clay if there's a good amount, and we'll use it, especially when it's soft clay like this, we'll use it for bulking out. And you know, if we've got a big sculpture, it's like free clay. And so we do try to use what we can, but I would hate to think about picking all the little pieces of plaster out and then trying to sculpt with it, and every time you're going in for the detail, oh, there's another chunk of plaster. So basically what you do is just take spray paint, the same glossy spray paint, and spray it in the cup, and then brush it on. Now normally I do this laying down, but so you can see what I'm doing, I want to do at least some of it. What's up? But you can come right up to the sculpture. It's not the end of the world if you get a little bit of on the sculpture. It just becomes a bit of a moisture barrier, which isn't good when you're trying to get the latex to set up. But it isn't that bad either, because it's usually not a problem, and if it is, you can just sand it out. Okay, so I've got that all covered, and you make sure and look at it carefully, make sure you've gotten it around all the edges so that no plaster shows. And you might give it 2 coats. I think I'll probably give it another coat once I lay it down. But that's the thing that'll make these molds come apart. Very important. So we're gonna lay them down, and then I'm gonna mix up the next batch of plaster, I should say, and off we go. So I've mixed up the next batch of plaster, and this is where it's easy. You just start pouring it in. It's like a bowl. It's so nice. You still have to, you know, brush the details and things, but gravity's your friend now. Okay, so now I just go in and do the same horizontal, vertical thing on the fingers and really everywhere. But like I say, it's much easier now. All right, I'm going to let the plaster thicken up a little bit, and we'll be right back. Okay, so now it's starting to thicken up, and I'm going to pay particular attention to these thumbs because they're upside down. And so you got to really make sure you're not missing. Okay, so I'm gonna let this sit. I'm gonna start mixing up my hemp batch, and for whatever reason, it seems like I need a little more plaster, like I'm thin down here. I could use a little more, so I'm gonna just make a bigger hemp batch to compensate for that. But as long as you've got everything covered and fairly smoothed out, doesn't have to be super smooth, then you're ready for the second batch. You don't want any exposed clay. So I'm gonna make that batch and we'll be right back. Okay, so I've made another batch, but I didn't make it quite as thick so that I could thicken this up just a little bit. Now, one thing I always try to mention when I do plaster videos is you don't want to wash your hands in the sink. You want to wash them in a 5-gallon bucket, which is what I use here. And that'll save you a lot of plumbing bills. And, you know, plaster goes down the drain and it can turn into a rock. It's usually not quite that bad, but
It'll test your patience.
it's a serious call the plumber kind of situation. All right, so we're gonna let this stiffen up a little, and we'll be right back. Okay, so we'll just get a little more on, and we'll start the hemp. Maybe a little more up here. Man, you're on cruise when you're doing the back half of a mold that you put a dam around, because it just, everything's easy compared to trying to put plaster on and you're fighting, you know, the gravity making it want to fall down, and so you gotta keep struggling with it, but this is easy. And you know, if you don't have hemp, you don't have to use hemp. And it's a safety measure, but we've made plenty of molds without using hemp, and a lot of them are still alive today. And in fact, in the old days, I never used hemp. So it's just one of those things. If you can get your hands on it, I would use it. If you can't, just be a little more careful with your molds when you're using them or carting them around, and you should be fine. And trust me, this stuff is tough. This is the hemp I drip plaster in. It's like nightmare. Well, maybe we'll just use it like that. Okay. Not pretty, you say? It's what's on the inside that counts.
Make sure to keep a positive outlook.
Okay, so we're on the home stretch, and for this, you need a hammer and a screwdriver. So the first step is to get the clay dam off the plaster. And this will show you where you pry. So you work your way around the mold. You don't try to do it all in one big move. Okay. Okay. Okay, so this side came out pretty clean. Let's see, maybe I'll try to pry some of this off and it'll be easier. We're gonna see if we can pry it off. Might save us a little work. Okay. Want an easy life? Sell insurance. Okay. So, let me show you the tools. So, this side, it's clean. It's all came out. That's what we like to see. This side mostly came out. Now the thumbs, I knew were going to be the toughest part, but you can try wrangling them around and see if they'll mostly come out. So far, this is easier than normal. There's many times when there's picking and picking and goes on and on. All right, let's see. Okay, so I won't bore you with getting the thumbs out of here, but that's all you do. And you know, to get some of the other stuff, like how we do things, we've got all sorts of videos, hundreds of videos. And if you just go to Distortions Unlimited on YouTube and click videos, up will come all these videos with everything you need to know about making monsters. So anyway, I'll finish this up and we'll see you next time to pour these and paint them, and we'll have some monster hands.